Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Corinne Scown and Tyler Huntington from the UC Berkeley National Lab, and they've been working on various techno-economic models and physical models of the many different decarbonization strategies we have available to us, and we'll be describing that here. Welcome.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is I'll start out with some slides and just give you a feel for the kind of modeling that we do at Berkeley Lab. And then I'm going to leave time for Tyler to demo some of the cool web tools that he's developed to try and get these kind of modeling capabilities out to the broader community. And so we very much welcome any kind of like interaction throughout. If you have questions or whatever, feel free to, I don't know what's easiest. If you put them in the chat, Greg, you can just like let me know if I'm missing that, or you know, you can interrupt me. But I will just go ahead.
I'll just partly read them out.
Okay, perfect. So I think this title is a little bit different than the one that I gave you guys, but techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessment just go together so well. They're like peanut butter and jelly. So we're going to talk about both of them. And this is kind of how you get a sense for, like at high level, you know, the costs of doing different things that we need to do to decarbonize the economy. And then like how well those things work at their stated goal, right? Decarbonization. And we'll talk about some other environmental impacts as well. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you guys, and so happy to have Tyler Huntington. He's a brilliant member of my team. We're going to try and give you kind of like a whirlwind tour of the stuff that we do. So some of these projects, like there's a lot of details. I'm not going to cover all the details, but if you want to dig into something, no problem, just stop me. So when I first got to Berkeley Lab, like more than 10 years ago, I guess it's been like 12 years, a lot of folks in the field were still treating the technologies itself that they were analyzing as kind of a black box. This was especially true in life cycle assessment, because life cycle assessment, like the people who were doing this research tended to have to be generalists. It was a small field. They were having to analyze all kinds of different technologies. Like LCA was their expertise, and then they didn't really have like a particular like class of technologies or subject matter that they were expert in. And so they just treat this like a black box, and you would have to go out and find data somewhere that's like, okay, what are the inputs to this thing? And what are the outputs? You know, be that a vehicle or a power plant or like some, you know, manufacturing facility. And then you could answer questions like, what is the greenhouse gas footprint of the thing you're making? You know, if you're making a battery, like how much fuel went into it? How like, what do we know about the emissions that came out of the facility? And then for costs, you know, that's really hard to model if you're not going to model the like details of the process. And so sometimes you would just be getting costs like stated from a manufacturer. They just say, this is what our cost is. And, you know, we're not going to give you any details about like how we got that number. But we're far past that now, fortunately. So now we're kind of in this realm where people have combined expertise in particular types of like production technologies or the operation of a complex system. And so we can really get into the like nitty-gritty details. And what this gives us is like a clearer picture of not just like what the environmental footprint is or what the cost is of doing something that we want to do to decarbonize the economy. And again, that's a broad class of technologies. But we can also say like, well, how can we make it better? Like that's one of the more interesting questions, is like, if we had to focus our efforts on something to make this cheaper or achieve sort of larger emissions reductions, what would we do? And so, yeah, you can ask questions like, how high does my yield need to be competitive with whatever the next best thing is? Can this process hit some kind of stated goals without breaking the laws of physics, right? You can get these like basic insights into your technology that you couldn't do before. So we take this kind of multidisciplinary approach to techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessment. And one of Berkeley Lab's, like, I guess you could say sort of claims to fame is that we do a lot of TEA and LCA for emerging technologies. So these are things that have not been commercialized yet. And I'd say that's like, it's not the only thing we do, but it is a niche where we've been able to kind of establish some amount of leadership. So you might start with technology development, you have a concept, maybe you have a lab prototype, you go on to like do some kind of demonstration at a larger scale. And then at that point, like we can take it from there and say, all right, like you're not going to build a commercial scale facility, not yet. but let's like model this out. You know, there are all kinds of engineering models that are really well set up and have been used by companies for decades that we can leverage to kind of do this in silico, right? Like, what does this look like if you did it at really large commercial scale? So you can get the kind of material and energy like flows in and out of the system. You can run different scenarios where you're not just doing one facility, but you say like, well, how many of these do we need to build? And like, maybe the costs vary depending on where you put them. You know, the costs of your inputs might vary. The distance that they have to be transported might vary. If you have access to like a pipeline, maybe the cost of transporting some like liquid fuel output is going to be different than if you have to truck it. So you can get a lot of information from that. And then we do this kind of integrated analysis where you start looking at not just the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, although that's really important, but you can look at energy use, you can look at like the water footprint, how much land you're occupying, the air quality impacts, and you can look at the cost, not just of producing something like, you know, a fuel or providing a service like energy storage, but you can go all the way through the use phase and end of life and do kind of a life cycle cost, even if different parties sort of bear the burden of those costs. It might not be the same entity paying for all of that stuff. And then ultimately, like this last piece is the really important one, and that's what was missing, I think, in kind of earlier, you know, a decade ago, was like this feedback. You know, what are our takeaways, and not just, you know, is this technology good or bad, but like, how can we improve it? You know, we kind of figured out where the bottlenecks are, and we can tell you what might make sense. So this is obviously not just me and Tyler. There's a whole team that does this work. This is the TEA LCA team at Berkeley Lab. That's not even inclusive of everybody. These are like the people who aren't remote. So we have a bunch more who are spread out across the country and work with us. And then of course we have like students and postdocs who sort of come in and out and work with us either on a short-term basis, or sometimes they're with us for, you know, 4, 5, 6 years. So it's a really lovely team to work with. We do work at varying stages of development, all the way from like very early stage, like research and development. You know, that could be stuff where you're just starting to get lab data. You model it, you're like, these costs are crazy. Let's talk about like how we might be able to tweak your process. And so you're like iterating at like the bench scale experiment level, all the way through to, you know, proof of concept. Like sometimes we're taking data from a pilot scale operation through to commercialization and maturity. We do like a little bit less on the side where something is like fully mature, unless we think it could change. But yeah, we kind of work along this continuum. So I should stop here and say that, like, although I'm talking about TEA and LCA as like one single approach, and in some, you know, in terms of the methods, like it is a class of modeling techniques that you can leverage, but you can use it for different stuff, right? So the first point that I like to make is like, it's a research field, and sometimes we're just answering cool research questions because they're interesting. And even better if it requires us to kind of stretch our like the methods that we know already. And sometimes that could mean like a novel method for modeling a particular system, or sometimes it means taking a couple different off-the-shelf methods that have never been integrated together in a particular way and like finding a way to link them. And so that can require some innovation. So it can just be like purely for research and, you know, writing good papers. We also can provide like technology specific insights. So I talked about like doing this like iterative approach where we're trying to then go back to the folks who are developing the technology and say, why don't you try tweaking this thing? Or like, here's like the sort of performance level that you have to get to for this to be viable. That is also a really useful function for TEA and LCA kind of integrated into a research program. You might be comparing or evaluating different technologies. So I'll give an example of that later, but like carbon dioxide removal is one where we've got different technologies that can effectively take CO2 out of the air and put it in some kind of stable form. And sometimes you just want to know, like, which of these is better? Like, given the state of technology today, if we don't think it's going to change like that much, tell me how much it costs per like functional unit I care about, you know, ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, and then tell me like, which of these should I be paying attention to, like investing a lot of money and scaling up? And those questions might come up for companies who could be looking at a subset of technologies that are relevant for them. It could come up for government agencies that are like, we've got grant money to throw at this thing. You know, please tell us like, where should we be prioritizing? You can also do these large scale scenarios. So I think you guys have had like Jesse Jenkins talk. So you've seen like these big like national or you know, in some cases global scale scenarios to say like, how do we get to like net zero greenhouse gas emissions? And sometimes like getting that picture of like what success looks like can be really informative, even if you're sort of working backwards from that. Like you're developing a policy that might be more specific, but just knowing kind of like where you ultimately want to get can be, you know, extremely instructive. So it's not just an academic exercise to do those kinds of scenarios. And then finally, policy design and regulatory impact assessment. So life cycle assessment gets used like directly in some regulatory policies. So California low carbon fuel standard, there are other states that also have low carbon fuel standards. CORSIA, that's used for sustainable aviation fuel. So they are directly using life cycle assessment to like assign carbon intensity scores and then tie those things directly to like basically monetary incentives. Okay.
So actually, at this point,
Yeah.
To what extent? I mean, you can write reports about this on specific questions, but the impact is obviously greater if you can just give tools to investment funds and so on, or development companies to say, you know, I can answer these questions for myself or compare technologies that were not, you know, combined or compared in a given paper. To what extent are you know, do you have that capability?
To what extent can you
give out simulations that random people can use to answer their own questions?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can do that. The only challenge is like there's no one group that's going to do like hyper detailed analysis on every single technology that somebody might be interested in considering. And so this actually gets to a really important point about like harmonization in this field across multiple groups. So like there are groups that do that like integrated assessment modeling and do these like really large scale scenarios that encompass probably most of the technologies that somebody is interested in that are kind of like more on the mature side of things. And in that case, yeah, I mean, you can use kind of off the shelf data from those scenarios. It might not be super granular, you know, it's going to be a little bit more hand wavy because that's just how it is when you do these really big scenarios. If you want to like use TEA and LCA data to run a comparison that nobody's done before, and especially if you want to pull those results like from if they came from different groups, the only challenge there is that those groups might be using different underlying assumptions, like super basic stuff like debt to equity ratio for like financing a facility, internal rate of return, like the underlying costs for the same stuff. Like one group might model the cost of a boiler differently than another. And so there is some like inertia in the field. You know, we, especially in the US, try to like align with assumptions that are sort of commonly used by everybody else so that you're not seeing like wild differences in the literature that have nothing to do with technology itself. Right. But it's not perfect. And it's definitely not perfect when you start comparing like analyses that happened in different countries. So like I was on a master's thesis committee for a student in South Africa recently, and like their TEA had like really different assumptions. And I thought, whoa, that would be really crazy if you modeled it that way in the US. They were like, this is quite standard actually. So.
In fact, this is kind of where the question comes from. You have, if I take several papers, I cannot compare them because they invariably have different assumptions. And I'll point up like hydrogen seems like has many possible global rollout scenarios that vastly change whether it's viable or not viable, and it's critical. So I guess the question is, this is why we want to run my own, but then start swapping out internal components to make sure they do use the same scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, well, kind of what you're talking about, it's like people do meta-analyses and you can just publish that.
Yeah.
Depending on how the original modeling was done, that may be like more or less difficult. You know, like if you don't have an Aspen license and somebody was doing all of their modeling in Aspen and you want to change things about like the engineering behind it, like not like the cash flow, but like, you know, some built-in thing where you're going to have to like fire up Aspen, I don't know, that may or may not be possible for you, like depending on expertise of your group and what you have licenses to. So yeah, but I think there's a lot of value in being able to leverage the stuff in the literature and do these kinds of meta-analyses where you can make sure you're making like an apples to apples comparison.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Were there any other questions before we move on? Okay, cool. So I'll try to go kind of fast so we got plenty of time for the demo. So next I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that we've been doing on sustainable aviation fuels. And again, this kind of gives you a flavor of the type of work that we do. So like, I think kind of the way that people have viewed like the bioeconomy has evolved over time. You know, we used to think a lot about like liquid fuels, right? Like biofuels were what everybody was talking about back in like 2007, 2010 and on. I mean, there were a few years where people were placing pretty big bets on biofuels, and that is still happening. It's more targeted and it's focused on sectors where it's difficult to electrify them. So things like sustainable aviation fuels. But the bioeconomy has also become interesting for a couple of other reasons. One is kind of producing like a diversity of products that we currently make from like petrochemical manufacturing. So the sense is like, if you want to become independent of fossil fuels, you have to become fully independent. So even if any one of these products is not produced at like a particularly large volume, and if you worked out the greenhouse gas emissions, it'd be a small fraction of like global emissions, that we kind of have to have like a full suite of solutions so that we just like don't need like crude oil anymore, and ultimately like, you know, don't need natural gas or don't need as much natural gas. The other thing that's come up is that plants are really good about sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere without any, you know, with the sort of minimal energy and effort inputs from us relative to like a direct air capture facility. And so you can also use those to then get carbon into some kind of stable form and do CO2 removal. So yeah, you maximize carbon in the ground. Here are some examples, like integrating into building materials, just putting CO2 underground. This picture of this like charm. They pump bio oil like downhole. And then you can do this option of like producing a lot of useful fuels and chemicals that we need as part of the broader suite of decarbonization strategies. So like, what do we need to get there? One of the things that we found in our research is that we work with a lot of people who are kind of on this like early side, like they're at the R&D stage. You know, you get yields and titers if you're like making something microbially that are at first like not particularly impressive. And you really need to do a few things. Like you need to get some of those pathways into microbial strains that are like industrially relevant and can really make like a lot of your product and you know, and in high concentrations. And then you start like scaling up production. And a lot of the collaborators that we work with are sort of finding this like early like valley of death, basically, where we don't have resources to do the kind of optimization and scale up that needs to happen right after you're done with your early stage R&D. There's like lots of basic science money, lots of early stage R&D, and then kind of getting it up over that hump to the point where you can commercialize it is really, really challenging. You know, one of the things we've noticed that's kind of come out of our analyses and our experiences working with the folks who are trying to kind of move these products from the R&D stage to commercialization is that like we're probably underinvesting as a country in like toll manufacturing, where you like go pay for somebody. You don't have enough money to build your own facility yet. You need to pay someone to like scale up production of the thing that you're making. Especially important if the thing you're making is not like a one-to-one replacement for something that's already on the market, right? So like your customers want to like test it and, try converting to something else or try incorporating it into a product. So, yeah, I think through our systems analysis, we've definitely run into some of these more practical issues that seem to be coming up over and over again. Yeah.
That's the typical role for venture capital, but is the problem that this is not, it's too risky for typical venture capital to touch because there's a capital, investments that are required?
Yeah. Like getting funding for some of these hard tech things is really tough. And I honestly feel for the investors because they are forced to vet a whole bunch of different technologies that they may or may not have much experience with. Like their comfort zone might be like software. And, they've expanded to invest in like hard tech. And they're considered, the same set of people might be considering like a biomanufacturing process. They might be considering some kind of like energy storage application. And so they have to figure out like which of these has legs, like who, where do I put my money? And so this actually gets to some of the tools that we've tried to, that we have deployed and that Tyler is going to show you some of. But like we've tried to, particularly for biomanufacturing, right? So we've looked at like sustainable aviation fuels, and then we've built the capability to model different like microbially produced products. We've taken the process models that we've worked for many years on and translated those into like a Python backend. We have these web tools where you can mess around with the actual engineering parameters and see how the costs change. And we also allow people to sort of put in like policy incentives, because we realize, especially for technologies that are relevant for decarbonization, often the economics don't make sense without the policy incentives yet. And the policy incentives are pretty generous. And so you really do want to be able to like incorporate those into your analysis. So we've started putting this stuff up here, and this is available. It's, the link is here, but we can also put it in the chat or something. But one of the interesting like user groups that I personally didn't expect was that investors are using this as part of their due diligence to understand like, what's the CapEx going to be when I finally have to put money into like scaling this production up? So building out these kinds of tools can be really useful for actually getting them commercialized, because you can give investors enough information that they feel confident in doing the vetting and making informed decisions about like where they want to put their money. From like a larger system-wide perspective, we do kind of like, we try to like identify like where the low-hanging fruit is. So, things for decarbonization that are like, they should be no-brainers. So like, we're never going to do the harder stuff unless we do this easy stuff. So one really obvious one is like bio-based processes. So things like ethanol production, renewable natural gas production, where you have a concentrated CO2 stream. And if there were ever going to be something that's like cheap to capture and put underground, it would be a nearly pure CO2 stream, as opposed to something that's post-combustion. So we try to kind of do those scenario analyses to just show people like, here's how much extra cost it would add. Like, here's how much you would theoretically need to get paid per ton of CO2 avoided for it to make economic sense for you. And then down the line, like when policies come out that actually do pay for this stuff, hopefully you can sort of compare them and say, this policy pays me enough to do it, or this policy doesn't pay me enough to do it. So even if there isn't something like an incentive in place, we try to kind of get this built in advance so people can make informed decisions when the time is right. The other thing we can do for earlier stage technologies is just set like performance thresholds. So this is a paper we published in PNAS about accumulation of like value-added chemicals in plants directly. So, I mean, this is something that happens commercially for some things, like cannabinoids being an example of that. But you can do it for all kinds of interesting products that would be useful replacements for like petrochemicals we use today. And so then the question was like, how much do you have to accumulate in the plant to make it worth your while to extract it and recover it? And so we developed these curves that say like, here's how much you need to have in order for this to like break even. And you can have sort of different values for the product itself. So a really expensive one, you can accumulate less and get away with that. If it's like a cheaper commodity product, then you better be accumulating more because you're not going to get paid that much per kilogram that you produce. But these are the kinds of things that we can do, kind of hopefully like looking forward and providing information that you might not use like right now, but it's going to be really useful in a few years. I'll skip through this, but just to say that we employ a broad suite of modeling tools, including like agroecosystem modeling. We collaborate with a really great group at Sandia National Lab on that to understand for these bio manufacturing processes, like what's going on with the feedstock as well, and how that's impacting things like soil carbon, because that's a really important part of the overall greenhouse gas footprint, positive or negative. Yeah, and then I mentioned, we sort of will like lay out, I thought this was a really nice study where we were able to kind of lay out all of the different approaches that were being pursued at the Joint BioEnergy Institute, where Tyler and I work, and kind of identify like which ones are kind of like win-wins, which ones might have trade-offs, where if you pursue one, it's going to make some other part of the process like more difficult for you. But it's useful to kind of just take stock of all of the different things that you might be working on that will ultimately be like linked up, and figure out which ones are going to work well together. And lastly, I'll just point out that for sustainable aviation fuels, one of the things that's been super interesting about working on these like bio-based alternatives is that you actually get higher energy density, which matters way more for aviation than it does for things like on-road applications, because the weight of your aircraft has a lot to, that really impacts how efficient your aircraft is. You're basically like using most of your energy to just get the plane off the ground. And so if you can do that with a fuel that takes up less space and doesn't weigh as much, that's extremely useful. And so we've been kind of going after these more energy dense molecules in an effort to just make that work better. It also works really well for like kind of specialty applications. So the military is particularly interested in some of these molecules. And so again, we'll talk about the tools later. I'll do at least one more example here. So this is like totally shifting gears. And maybe I should pause again for questions if there are any.
Yes, I should show the question.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Corinne. Sorry, I joined a little late. But on SAF, I had a question on SAF. Is SAF ready for prime time? Where is it in its life cycle?
Oh, yeah. Well, so great question. SAF is, it is. There are some production routes that are kind of like earlier in their commercialization. So the ones that I just showed you are at that stage where they need to move to the point of like being optimized, going to toll manufacturers. Like that's where some of the molecules are that I just talked about. The most mature option is HEFA. So hydroprocessed esters of fatty acids, and that is like you can make that from like oils from oil crops, like soybean oil, for example, or you can make it from like waste fats and oils, like used cooking oil, tallow, corn oil, that kind of thing. And so HEFA, there are a bunch of planned facilities. There are facilities that are making that now. And then kind of in the middle of that would be like the ethanol to jet, where I think that is going to be on the market this year.
Okay.
That's my understanding. And that's like, there's a company called LanzaJet that's doing that.
LanzaJet. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take a look. Yeah, the reason I ask is because some of these airlines have stopped buying credits to offset their emissions because it looks like they see SAF as a very viable, scalable technology in the near term. So they're focusing on efforts in that direction versus buying offsets.
Yeah, well, I won't get too deep into the policy, but there's this whole like CORSIA applies internationally. You can Google this like CORSIA if you're not. And I think it's like voluntary participation, but basically you either need to source SAF and they keep track of the like greenhouse gas footprint of the SAF that you're sourcing. Or you can buy some sort of carbon offsets. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert on like exactly what the restrictions are on like what sorts of offsets you can buy as an alternative to sourcing SAF. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely getting scaled up. The downside is like some of the lowest greenhouse gas intensity SAF is made from these waste feedstocks, which like waste feedstocks by definition are like the supply is finite, right? At some point you don't have any more waste. Yeah.
No, great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Any other questions before I move on? All right, great. So let's totally switch gears. We'll talk about batteries for a little bit. So there's a couple of folks in my group who've been working on energy storage and applying a lot of the same kinds of like systems analysis techniques that we use. But we're interested in like where it makes sense to use lithium-ion batteries. And in this case in particular, we wanted to dig into this question of stationary battery storage for the grid. And we know that there are particularly high emitting power plants that serve peak loads. So they don't operate very often, but when they do, they emit a lot. We call these peaker plants. And, you know, depending on how you kind of project out the like way that the grid is going to evolve, you know, these might end up operating more often or for like longer periods of time when they do have to get turned on. If we end up in situations where we have like extreme heat and people are running their air conditioners and stuff. And so we wanted to see if it was possible to replace some of these. In California, it's largely natural gas fired peaker plants with batteries, which would be zero emitting at the point of use. So in this case, we had great data because we could just go to like California Independent System Operator, CAISO. We could get data on exactly how these power plants operate. Then we could figure out how you would design batteries to replace them, and then kind of cost those out and see like, does it make sense? And if we start putting different monetary values on CO2 emissions, if we put different monetary values on like human health impacts associated with the air pollution, how does that change the economics for the system? So this shows you kind of how we model the hypothetical behavior of a battery that's installed to replace a peaker plant. Like the first takeaway is that if you put a battery there, you definitely should not only use it to do exactly what the peaker plant did. So you can kind of open it up and say, all right, battery, you can also do arbitrage. Oh, and by the way, you can also sell other grid services like frequency regulation. And that will make a lot more sense. So it's not going to be a one-to-one replacement. You kind of have to like relax your constraints and let the battery do some other things to make extra money. Otherwise, it's like really, the costs really aren't going to work out. And then we looked at all of these different facilities and kind of figured out like which ones would make the most sense. Now, the caveat here, so we have this like net present value. So anything higher than zero should be good, right? But you will notice that a bunch of these are less than zero, meaning like, oh no, you shouldn't replace these plants with batteries. The caveat here is that each facility will negotiate resource adequacy payments, which are basically like power generators getting paid to like exist. And you can stack those with other things like frequency regulation. And so depending on whether the battery gets paid more than the peaker power plant was getting paid, these dots could all shift up. Like it could make more economic sense. And in fact, we have come to appreciate that it probably does look more favorable for the batteries after you start incorporating resource adequacy payments. And we've gotten outreach from investors utilities, basically indicating that some of these things that we analyze, like they're doing them. So they're really interested in the data because they're going to do it in real life. So this is kind of interesting.
So actually, a quick question on that one, because that one's really neat.
Yeah.
Comparing peaker or like diesel or something, or natural gas compared to batteries. Our current batteries don't last for more than a month, whereas peaker can like deliver fuel in the summer and use it in the winter. Is that part of the analysis?
Yeah, I mean, we model optimal charging behavior. So we have like, hourly like prices for electricity, and the batteries have to charge. We also integrate the fact that like you get capacity fade over time as you cycle these batteries. And so like, yeah, the battery lifetime thing is interesting. So there's obviously like, yes, the battery has to like charge itself up, and we model that. Over time, the battery's capacity fades. Anybody who like has a phone knows that, or a laptop knows that this happens, right? And so one of the questions was like, that's not really the same thing that happens with power plants. Like, how do you deal with this when you put a battery on the grid? And there's at least some folks who think you would basically oversize your battery so that over the lifetime of that battery actually being in service for its intended like stationary storage use, that you would only commit to a level of service that's commensurate with the expected capacity at the very end of its life. So basically you're paying to make your battery bigger than it really needs to be, because the way the contracts work like don't really allow for like reduced capacity and reduced level of service over time. So this has not been integrated into any other studies, at least as of like when this one came out. But it was, we heard the same thing from multiple people. So I think this does actually happen, that you may have to kind of oversize your battery.
Right, makes sense. Oh, and Ashish? You're muted.
Sorry, I was on mute. It took me some. No, this is a very interesting slide, Corinne. A couple questions on this, understanding this value chain. Have you also factored in? I see upfront materials and assembly. Have you factored in how upstream do you go in the value chain analysis? Do you go up to the mining element when you're mining the material? And second question is, are you looking at how the battery is being charged? What is the source power? Is it green or not in this analysis?
Yeah. So I'll answer these one by one. So for the economics,
yeah,
I mean, everything's incorporated, but we don't have to like go and like model the operations of the mine, right? Like you can just look at like how much it costs to like buy those inputs, and that's good enough. So like, yes, it's all in the economic model. In the life cycle greenhouse gas model, that is also included. So you'll see stuff like, let's see, module materials and assembly, operations maintenance, battery replacement, upfront materials and assembly. So let's see, I'm looking at the emissions category, like how we broke this down. Module materials and assembly. That includes all of the upstream emissions associated with producing everything that goes into those batteries.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. The paper's open source or open access. I'd be happy to share it. It's got like all of the details that you could possibly need. There's tons of stuff in the supporting information too.
Would love to read the paper.
Yeah, great. How do we model the actual the emissions from charging? So there's different ways that you can do that. In this case, we used a model that was developed by my co-author and wonderful colleague, Max Aufhammer. They had taken data for the California grid, this CAISO data, and developed a regression model. So he's an economist. Like, this is what they do. They develop really fancy regression models. So for like every hour of the year, you could model like what is based on like historical, like real data, what power plants are responding when you like increase load on the grid. And so that was what we used to estimate the emissions, was like specific power plants ramping up or down. Like, and actually it wasn't, you didn't even have to like make that jump. Like we just had like emissions and you could say like any hour of the day, like you add load, what, like how do the emissions change?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Super fancy model. I do not know how to do those crazy fancy regression models. Tyler probably does. Okay. So this was another study kind of along the same lines, but instead of stationary energy storage, we were interested in trucking. And basically like when and where does it make sense to electrify probably, you know, one of the hardest things to electrify in freight, which is heavy duty, long haul freight. We did include drayage corridors as well. So it's kind of these like 154 interstate long haul like corridors, and then 46 drayage corridors. Drayage meaning like the trucks that the sort of shorter haul, like they'll go from like the port to, you know, like a rail terminal or something. Okay, so we integrate a lot of stuff to make this work. And this was actually the culmination of like several different studies. So we've been kind of doing this for a while and then building on our model each time to kind of make it better, fix things that we thought didn't work that well. So we modeled diesel trucks, and we modeled the like emissions controls associated with those. So, you know, controlling like nitrous oxide emissions, NOx, and particulate matter. So diesel particulate filter that's what that means. SCR is selective catalytic reduction. And then we model the electric trucks. We assume lithium-ion batteries. We have some like assumptions baked in about the specific chemistry, but I won't get into that. We model the electricity grid. We use data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They've done like scenarios out to 2050 at the balancing area level, which you can see this is like an NREL invention. This doesn't map to like balancing authorities, which I know is confusing. But and then we look at hourly marginal generation. So if you plug your truck in anywhere in the US at a particular hour of the year on any given year in the future, like what kind of power plants are ramping up to meet that demand? We have sort of different model years for the diesel trucks as well. And then depending on like where those trucks, like what time of day they start driving and where they're driving. And we do have like origin destination points from the freight analysis framework, which is a public data set. We can develop these different like charging load scenarios and translate those into power plant emissions. From there, we can figure out what air pollutant emissions are getting emitted and where, and then estimate the human health damages. So we use an integrated assessment model called INMAP. This is like the gold standard for air pollution folks, and you can monetize those things with the social cost of carbon for greenhouse gas emissions, and then you can use the value of a statistical life for human health impacts. And that largely covers it. If you just look at like mortality as a result of air pollution impacts and then put the value on a human life. Okay, and so ultimately you can get corridor level impacts, like in what year does a particular corridor switch from being like not favorable to electrify to favorable to electrify? This was so fun to do. And it can be different depending on climate change and human health. So in general, like from a climate change perspective, it's better sooner. Like most corridors are good now. From a human health perspective, it's like slightly less favorable. It just takes longer. But we'll get into the results right now. Oh yeah, grid scenarios matter. Like huge shout out to NREL. They really helped us out, like understanding their data, kind of, yeah, like modeling this was not trivial. And a wonderful grad student named Will McNeil developed a model based on some of NREL's data. Okay, impacts of freight electrification over time. So the way to read this, now we did every single year out to 2050, but those would be very large figures. So we're only going to show you like sort of points at different decades. So renewable energy costs, there's two scenarios that NREL modeled. Actually, they did multiple scenarios, but we show the high and the low renewable energy costs. So low renewable energy cost means like a lot of cheap, like wind and solar. High renewable energy cost means it's not that cheap. And then this is like the current year, this is 2050, and this paper was published in like late 2023. So just a few months ago. And you can see, like, from a climate change perspective, like, it's good to electrify most corridors now. You should just like full steam ahead. There is this like weird result where under a low renewable energy cost scenario, the marginal generator is actually dirtier. And the funny thing about that is, like, this does show up in real data. If you like aggressively deploy a bunch of wind and solar now because it's cheap, it starts to eat into like coal-fired generators that are still online, which is, you're thinking like, that's awesome. But then if you go and add extra load to the grid, those coal-fired generators end up being on the margin. Like, they are the next like cheapest thing that's not generating, and they ramp back up. So it's a funky result, but like we found this multiple times. This seems to bear out in the actual data, but it's like a short-term phenomenon. Yeah, for renewable energy costs, and then, oh, go ahead.
But is that a function of not having batteries in this model, or just something else that you says the total capacity with batteries is so large that whatever's left is coal?
Yeah, so in the very near term, like now, I mean, you're kind of dealing with like what's online now, plus like kind of very aggressive like near-term deployment of wind and solar. Like, batteries are still, I mean, they're costly to deploy at a really large scale.
Right.
So yeah, that's why part of this is kind of a near-term thing. Also, I mean, I will just point out, like, batteries are not great for like seasonal storage. Like, you can't really do that. So
we should be thinking of like what makes up for the intermittency of the renewables is dirty power.
Yeah, yep, right. Pretty much in the near term.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets cleaner in the long term.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, from a human health standpoint, it does take a little bit longer for all of these corridors to start looking good. And in the long run, like, low renewable energy cost is better. You do still have this kind of area in the Northeast that just doesn't have like great renewable resources. And they also have a lot of like pretty dirty power plants, and not all of those are offline by 2050, right? Some of those hang around. Like, this is like, I went to school in Pennsylvania. There's coal plants. And so there are kind of these like holdouts even in 2050. Now, the interesting thing is, if you start factoring in the impacts of policy, so this factors in like all of the credits and stuff that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the results are really striking. Like, basically, from a human, I mean, it was already favorable from a climate change standpoint, right? Even without the IRA. But when you factor in the IRA, suddenly, like in 2030, your map looks so much better than it did in 2030 before all of these extra credits are factored in from the IRA. So you basically, like, it buys you like a decade. You kind of get to accelerate to the point where it's favorable to electrify freight on most corridors. So that was a really interesting result. And it kind of like takes along, like, even those holdouts in the Northeast that still looked not that great by 2050, like those are gone in this other scenario. They start to look favorable to electrify from a human health standpoint. So I won't spend too much time on the rest of the slides because I want to have time for Tyler to do a demo of the web tools, but selecting battery chemistries is really important. We are continuing this work and starting to incorporate more detailed modeling of the actual battery lifetime and the capacity fade, because like batteries unfortunately don't degrade just like really, really slowly and steadily. They basically hit an inflection point where it really like drops off a cliff. And there's uncertainty as to like when exactly that inflection point happens. And so that is why, I mean, what I'm showing you is like some old results from like a study we did in California on like second life batteries. But like the point remains that you need to know where that inflection point is in terms of the storage capacity of the battery in order to say with confidence like how the economics work out, especially when you're incorporating these into something like a truck where you need to be able to sell that truck used, and you have to know like, when am I going to have to replace my battery? That has a huge impact. So I'm going to skip the CDR part because I think you guys are going to separately invite Jennifer Petridge to speak, and she will talk about that. So I guess what I will finish with, I just want to leave you with while Tyler's getting his demo set up, is that like doing these analyses is complicated. It requires integration of a bunch of different models, but we are really trying to figure out creative ways to get these things in a form where we can share them more broadly. Anybody can use them, and web tools are a nice way to do that. And so Tyler will talk a little bit about some of the like geospatial modeling that we've put online, as well as the TEA and LCA. All right, Tyler, take it away, and don't forget to unmute.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks for the reminder. I probably wouldn't have unmuted. Can everyone see the tools screen up now?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, so as Corinne alluded to, we have developed this ecosystem of web-based tools to share out our modeling work, which is obviously tied up in published papers. But we want to obviously make it as interactive as possible for both the research community and industry. As Corinne mentioned, there's been increasing interest from investors in using these tools to estimate things like scale-up costs, CapEx, OpEx, for some of these emerging technologies. So the homepage for this ecosystem of tools is lead.jbei.org. And each of the tools here operates independently really nicely, and there is also some interoperability between them, which we can demo today. And I'll start by showing you the Biositing tool. And this tool is a interactive mapping platform for showing you what the bioeconomy looks like from a bird's eye view across the US. And a little backstory on the origins of this tool. Initially, it just covered California. It was funded by a California Energy Commission grant and looked at all of the bioeconomy resources and infrastructure in California. And we realized that scaling this out to the national level could really provide a lot more value. So over time, it evolved into this national tool. And what we've done here is aggregated data from a variety of sources, both empirically collected survey data from like the USDA, National Agricultural Surveys, as well as some modeled data from the Billion Ton Study, which was last released in 2016, and hopefully there should be a new release coming out relatively soon. So some of this data does seem a little outdated, and in fact the NAS data from 2017 will soon be replaced by the latest release of that survey data, which just came out. And so we show a lot of resources that tie into the bioeconomy as feedstocks for bioproduct and biofuel production, and as well as existing infrastructure such as facilities that are already processing those feedstocks and producing things like biofuels, renewable diesel, SAF. So that's what a lot of these points are representing in the map. And we also show some other things of interest when thinking about the bioeconomy. So one of the things that has become especially in the forefront recently is thinking about how scaling up the bioeconomy will impact different socioeconomic groups differently. And obviously, we don't want to perpetuate historical patterns of disproportionate impact on groups that have been historically marginalized. So one of the things we recently added is this layer of environmental justice indicators, which shows you at a census tract level whether or not census tracts are identified as disadvantaged from a variety of criteria that relate to climate change impacts, socioeconomic indicators, and other environmental indicators that play into human health hazards. So when thinking about where we are going to site future facilities for producing biofuels, bioproducts, we want to be conscious of where historically the energy economy has had negative impacts on different folks. And we also got these transmission regions showing you just, they're kind of simplified from the actual grid, but the general transmission regions that have implications for the cost of electricity, depending on where your thinking about siting a plant, and also have tax policy implications for tax incentives. So just bringing this all together in a way that you can really visualize how the country looks and how it might look if we were to scale things up. So one of the cool features of this tool is this siting mode, where you can go to any place on the map and run a hypothetical scenario of placing a new facility in a location. So for example, you might go somewhere that looks relatively resource rich, indicated by these green shades, and put a point down there and say you might want to put a SAF plant up here or an ethanol facility. You could see whether that site has good feasibility based on the surrounding biomass that shows up within a defined buffer region of your location. And you can change that buffer region over here to whatever sort of supply radius you want to consider for a given scenario. And then each of these bubbles is representative of a type of feedstock that you could expect within that buffer radius based on the data that you've selected in these filters to the left, and depending on whether or not you've selected different types of feedstocks that you could accept at this facility, that will impact what shows up in your buffer zone. And then taking this sort of scenario analysis one step further, you can run a technoeconomic analysis for this facility, and then following up on that and a life cycle assessment to see what those CapEx, OpEx, and environmental impacts of that site might look like. So we have a series of built-in examples of products that you might select from for producing at a given location. And then going to our TEA LCA tool, which can also be accessed from that homepage I started from, will run, it's a little slow, but it will run a model that we've developed based on simulation software and essentially developed proxy models for in Python to give you a system view of producing that product at that particular location specific to the feedstocks that were available within the buffer. And we show you sort of a process flow diagram of those major stages involved in producing your product.
I might just jump to the other page in the interest of time.
Oh, did it not jump in the screen share? I'm sorry.
No.
How do I change the tabs?
Oh, yeah, probably open a new tab.
It opened a new tab. Let me try.
Well, you share the whole screen, so we'll see all the tabs.
Do you know how to share the entire screen?
Yeah, you stop sharing this, and then you reshare, but now whole screen.
Entire screen. Google Chrome. Oh, Google Chrome doesn't allow me to. That's weird.
Oh, that might be a security thing. So maybe just share the tab by itself.
All right, let me share the tab. All right, sorry about that. So this is what our TEA LCA tool looks like once the model has been run. Corinne had a few screenshots of this in her slides, but we have all these process parameters in these sections to the left, which relate to specific process stages in your system. And a lot of the data in this feedstock supply sector is ported over directly from that biositing map and is specific to the biomass that you allowed in your buffer region and the feedstocks that you selected as acceptable. And then the moisture content, feedstock cost, all these different compositional elements to your feedstock are computed based on what's available to you. And then a lot of the other parameters we've set as sort of reasonable defaults based on kind of a baseline scenario, which you can change up to these different built-in scenarios for state of technology and sort of an optimal case. Or you can go in and adjust any of these process parameters yourself, and the model will update correspondingly. You just have to obviously rerun it. So in this minimum selling price model, which is what MSP stands for, we're showing you what the production cost of your product, in this case ethanol, looks like, broken down by these major process stages. For those unfamiliar with the term minimum selling price, that's just the price at which you would need to sell the product on the market in order for the entire project of the facility to be sort of break even over the lifespan of its projected lifespan. And so we give you some visualizations of what those cost breakdowns look like. We include the RIN credits in this case, which are policy incentives that would offset the cost, and the electricity credits that you would get from selling electricity produced in the facility back to the grid. And then based on those offsets, we give you a net minimum selling price and show you what the CapEx and OpEx breaks down into as well. And all of this data can be downloaded, and along with documentation of all the assumptions that go into the model here. These other two tabs show you what the water footprint of this system would incur based on producing, a certain amount of ethanol, and the greenhouse gas emissions involved from cradle to grave of that system. So everything from the TEA to the LCA is kind of built in here, and we have these examples for a variety of products that have been really well studied in our research group, and you can run them based on sort of the data that we've developed through kind of rigorous system simulations. But we've recently added this custom option where you can go in, and if you know a lot of details about a certain product that you want to model, which isn't off the shelf, you can enter those in here, and the data given is purely for demonstration purposes. This isn't for a real product, but you can ostensibly run a model for a custom product and get similar outputs, the same types of outputs, and it's not as necessarily as going to be as accurate or granular, because we know a lot more about these well-established pathways, but it's a good starting point for getting some sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations on what a TEA or LCA might look like. And then I think that's a pretty good summary of this tool. Anything to add on this, Corinne?
Oh, this is great. Thank you, Tyler. I know some of the numbers looked a little crazy because I think the glucose and xylose yield got like pushed to 0, but like, yeah, it's years and years of work have gone into this. And
this is incredible. Actually, let me ask you one final question about this thing. This is excellent as a forward analysis. Have you run it in a inverse design mode where it's like, just where would I make an ethanol plant, if I had to?
Oh, sort of like an optimization case?
Yeah, cite it for me. Tell me what parameters, variants I should use, that kind of thing. What tax credits I must demand.
We haven't really explored that use case. I mean, I think it's a really valid one for sure. And given finite number of resources to build new facilities, you want to answer that question of where our resources best spent. But we haven't really dug into that question with existing tools.
Cool.
Yeah,
And just as a practical matter, is this stuff available as like a Python library in addition to the GUI version? Because then you can shove it into optimization tools.
Right. At the moment, it is not. It's in a private repo. I think we have intentions of open sourcing it as a Python library that folks could utilize for those kinds of purposes. And also building out an API for folks to use in a more sort of programmatic way. But at the moment, it's just the GUI on the web.
All right. That makes sense. Well, thank you very much. It's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for having us.